a very warm welcome to you to Social Justice Ireland's annual conference. We have a large attendance, we have some excellent speakers, and we have a challenging topic to address for the day. The topic for today is towards well-being for all. And I think that this is a very good moment to discuss something of this nature. There's all sorts of issues that are arising about economic growth and how it's under pressure and so on at the moment. And we ask questions about what is the purpose of economic growth? Is it to create more jobs or to increase the total tax take or to make as many people as possible rich or to eradicate poverty and inequality? What's the point? What's the purpose of the growth? To make housing and healthcare and education and transport available to everybody? Is that the purpose of it all? Because if it is, we might at one level think we're doing very well in Ireland, but at another level, we have serious questions. We have almost 600,000 people living in poverty, of whom almost 160,000 are children, and almost 100,000 actually have jobs, but they're still living in poverty. Not just that, there's huge outpatient treatment waiting lists for in health. We have 122,000 households having an ongoing social housing problem. We have a whole lot of other issues. And I suppose the question we have to ask ourselves is, what has well-being got to do with all of this? Is well-being actually being delivered? Now, the success or failure of an economy is traditionally measured in terms of gross domestic product or gross national product. And we have in Ireland developed gross national GNI star, as we call it, to sort of maybe correct for some of the challenge or the sort of misreadings that are being generated by GDP and GNP, because in many ways, these are not all that accurate in terms of giving us an idea of what is going on in the society, and particularly they don't take into account the impact on or the damage that may be caused to people or places in the production of goods and services. So some serious questions to be addressed here. So we're looking at it today through this whole prism of well-being, looking at the health and happiness of individuals. How do we measure success or failure in a society? And that's a serious question, and the response to that question has emerged across the world in recent decades as a key issue. And not alone that, it has turned up as well in the programme for government of the current government in Ireland. So these are the kinds of parameters, these are the kinds of issues that we will be looking at today. You're more than welcome to join us. We have a terrific panel of speakers lined up. One small thing, we have a hashtag that you can use if you're tweeting. That's hashtag SJIConf, C-O-N-F, that's for conference. So it's hashtag SJIConf. And with that introduction, I don't have any hesitation now in handing over into the anchoring of the day and the conference into the capable hands of Mick Clifford. Mick needs no introduction to people who attend this conference annually because he chairs it each year for us. He's an award-winning journalist. He's a broadcaster. He's an author, an award-winning author as well. And he writes in the Irish Examiner. He has quite a range of experience. I'm not going to go and embarrass him anymore. So over to you, Mick, into your capable hands for the rest of the day.
Thanks very much, Sean. You're getting close to embarrassing me there, but we'll let it go. Folks, you're all very welcome to this, the 35th annual social policy conference. Now, as we say, as Sean pointed out, it's going to be a very interesting and varied contributions we're going to have today. In this first session, we're going to run from today, or from now, excuse me, until about 11:20. We're going to have two papers over the course of this first session, and we'll break for a 10-minute coffee break. One very important feature, just to alert everybody, please, we'd love if you would use the Q&A function on your Zoom, because we want to get some feedback, and our panelists would be anxious to address any questions, particularly that you may have for any of them. And that's why we're here, is to question and probe all of these papers and the issues. So please use the Q&A function. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to as many as possible at the end of each session. At the end of each session, we're going to have a Q&A relating to the papers that were presented. And just finally, as Sean said, the Twitter machine, as Vincent Brown used to call it, hashtag SJICONF is to tweet about the conference at. So that's it. And without any further ado, I'll introduce you to our first speaker. And she's Riley Lenalampi, who is the Finnish ambassador to Ireland. Riley served as the chief chef de cabinet for the Minister for Foreign Affairs between 2015-2019. She was responsible for foreign and security policy and for relations with other ministries, state administration, and representatives of other countries. She held various international positions and has a strong background in foreign and security policy. Before serving as chef de cabinet, she worked as the counsel to the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Parliament of Finland. The title of her paper is The Finnish Social Security System and Innovations Paving the Way Towards a More Just and Equal Society.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this opportunity to speak at this conference amongst all these experts. And good morning to everybody from the Finnish residents here in Donnybrook, Dublin. I really treasure and I'm very honored to be here, and I will try to discuss the Finnish system and the innovations that Finland has put forward in terms of trying to pave the way towards a more equal society. President Martti Ahtisaari, the Nobel laureate for peace, who also worked in the Northern Ireland peace process, has said, and I quote, "The Nordic model has not come about in a vacuum, but has required a lot of hard work and sincere commitment, both from political leaders and the citizens. The challenge is not only how to create wealth, but also how we use it." End of quote. The basic idea of the Finnish model, or more generally, the Nordic model, is to pursue universal welfare policies, which means that public programs, services, and social transfers are designed to serve everyone living in Finland. In many ways, Ireland and Finland are very similar countries. And in fact, this year we celebrate 60 years of our diplomatic relations. We are both open export-driven economies, prosperous democracies. Finland is physically 5 times bigger than Ireland, but we share the rural and urban challenge in terms of providing services to rural and urban areas. Ireland is a very young nation, while we in Finland are already graying. You would think, why am I here speaking about Finland? We in Finland, we very much believe in peer-to-peer sharing of lessons learned and also challenges that we have encountered. There is no one-size-fits-all model of comparing social security systems has proved very difficult. But learning from each other's experiences and failures can be inspiring and of mutual benefit. My own story is part of the social evolution in the Finnish society. I was born in the 50s as the youngest child to a rural family. We had, and we still have, 6 daughters and 3 boys in our family. We were born on the west coast of Finland. My father had a basic education, and when he was 18, he had to go to the war against Soviet Union for 5 years, and that had an enduring life experience for him. My mother, very exceptionally that time, had a vocational training. She was actually a trained, what you would call, professional milkmaid, so she knew everything about cows, pigs, and chickens. Our farm was small, and all children worked in the fields and at home. But the municipality provided the basic public health and social services. I still remember when the community nurse came to the regular checkups and those frightening vaccinations. But it's very clear in hindsight that without the maternity grants, free education, free school meals, and basic health services, it would not have been possible for us children to gain an education and meaningful occupations. I was the first one to go to university and get a degree. So how did Finland make it? Finland, like Ireland, was very poor 100 years ago, but we did have some characteristics that helped build a society that is now known as the Nordic Welfare Society. So I will mention a few of those characteristics. Trust is one. Finland was part of Sweden for almost 700 years, and that shared Nordic history has had a significant impact on our legal system, respect for the rule of law, and trust in authorities and civil service. Corruption has never taken roots in Finland. Today, Finland ranks among the least corrupt countries in the world. Education, of course, is another one. Local communities were isolated, and early on they had to take responsibility on basic services, including education. Education was initially made available through the so-called rowing countryside schools. My mother attended one of those, and I still remember that she had a very amazingly widespread knowledge about mathematics and culture, for example. Reading and writing became widespread. One motivation for this was that these skills were a requirement for marriage for both men and women. Women's position was key in the development. Perhaps the most long-lasting achievement in terms of women's role was that by 1906, women could not only vote, but could stand as candidates in the elections. So this resulted in 19 influential women being elected to the first parliament in 1907, 1908, including Miina Sillanpää, who became the first female minister in 1920s. She proposed several legislative initiatives during her time in the parliament, but she also understood the value of making concrete steps of advancement, and she founded the first home shelter for single mothers. Women's contribution and responsibility in work life in rural Finland had always been equal to men's. That was the case also at my home. During the wars against Soviet Union from 1939 to 1945, women took charge of many industrial positions and ran the economy while men were at front. That paved the way to the more general understanding of women's role in society. Women worked within parties. Women-only parties never really took off in Finland, neither did gender quotas. Working from within was not always easy, but it resulted in long-lasting reforms. And perhaps it also encouraged the men to work for equality and made them to see the important role that women play in society. After the Civil War and the wars against the Soviet Union, it was widely understood in Finland that poverty and inequality needed to be tackled to ensure political stability. One driving force for the strong support for social safety nets was that the Civil War was partly linked to the social and economic inequality in the society. Uniting the nation was important. Compulsory education and universal army defense conscription meant that people with different social status and backgrounds shared the same classrooms and barracks, and that helped integrate the society. Creating extensive child healthcare clinics in 1920s proved to be crucial investment in well-being. A great innovation was the Universal Child Benefit Allowance set up in 1948. Already within 2 years, 1 million children benefited from that system. The second point was that that allowance was paid directly to the mother, and for many women, that was the first money of their own. That gave them certain independence and helped embed gender equality. Dear friends, today Finland enjoys one of the most advanced and comprehensive welfare systems in the world. designed to guarantee decent living conditions for all. The social security system reflects the traditional Nordic belief that the state can intervene on citizens' behalf. There are three core policies in the system. Firstly, social insurance, for example, pensions, sickness, and employment benefits. Secondly, welfare, for example, childcare services and services for disabled people. And thirdly, a comprehensive public health system. Structurally, the system is divided into two. The first one is residence-based social security support, for example, maternity allowance and sickness allowance. And secondly, the employment-based social security, for example, retirement and old age pensions. Residence-based social security is financed by tax, and it's administered by the Social Insurance Institution of Finland. And the earnings employment-based social security is financed by contributions to private pension companies and social security funds. And they are administered by the Finnish Center for Pensions. There are, of course, challenges also in Finland and limits of the welfare society. Society and people's demands are not the same as they were when the original welfare framework was built. The way people perceive the role of the state is changing. Luckily, the European Social Security Survey that monitors the trends in welfare attitudes shows that the overall support to income distribution in the EU is still strong. The 5 principles when we discuss the Finnish systems are social productivity, equality and equity, universalism, public responsibility, and solidarity. I will comment 2 of those. In social productivity discourse, a key issue is the financing, how the revenue is collected and what are the limits. So the states need to ensure a production base through technological innovation and investments in education. The main argument for the public social services is that a well-functioning and prosperous economy needs healthy and prosperous people. It is sometimes argued that the egalitarian welfare state diminishes motivation to work. Empirical findings seem to suggest the opposite. Finland experienced a deep economic recession in the early 90s. Welfare cuts were made to reduce social spending, but the crisis showed that the system was able to absorb macroeconomic shocks and stabilize living conditions when needed. Solidarity has been a basic key of the development of our social security. The role of social partners has been crucial for constructing the model. Employer federations and trade unions have played an important role, not only in establishing collective bargaining systems, but initiating many legislative structures. So I will mention a few of what we call the Finnish innovations in social security. It is said that social investments in children has been the key to the success. Direct income transfers to families with children are extensive. The aim is to appreciate the potential of each individual. Healthcare for pregnant mothers has been self-evident for a long time. Single parents have special supports. Finland relies heavily on public daycare arrangements. The primary caregiver is professional either in a daycare center or family care that operates under the public early childhood education and care system. The great innovation is, of course, the maternity package. It has been made available for all mothers for over 70 years. I gave one to your Minister McEntee when she became pregnant over a year ago. This box is not only a box of clothes or a box to sleep in, where I was also sleeping in when I was born. The key element of the system was and is to provide the mothers access to public health services. A prerequisite, a condition for receiving the maternity box or package is that the mother visits a doctor or a maternity clinic for a check before the 4th month of pregnancy. This innovation was a turning point in improving the health of mothers and babies in Finland. Today, nearly all first-time mothers now choose the maternity package rather than the money, which is 170 euros if you don't take the package. It is a package of 56 useful items for the child and the mother, and it changes every year while staying true to its roots, which is that you give a same set of clothes to all babies. It highlights the principle that all people are born equal. Education is another factor that deserves to be mentioned. The Finnish education system is considered exemplary and ranks high in many surveys. Universal access to education was a fundamental goal from the start of the nation building in Finland. Now, the aim is to ensure equal opportunity to fully mobilize all available human resources to boost innovation and economic development. This means that secondary and upper secondary education is free, no book expenses before upper secondary school, no tuition for universities, a universal support system for students, state-guaranteed loans, irrespective of family background. The high-class teacher training is a key element also. Challenges remain, and lately issues related to access to third-level education and segregations have emerged. One of the great Finnish innovations related to education is free school meals. Finland was the first country in the world to serve free school meals in 1940s already. School meals are investment in the future. They build equality between children from different backgrounds. Meals are now provided to all students from 6 to 18 years old. The rationale behind this is that well-balanced meals improve students' health and well-being, which in turn improves their learning potential and outcomes. It is one of the elements that contribute to the success of Finland's education system. Today, these meals also teach children about nutrition, good eating habits, international food cultures, as well as environmental impact of food. Finland is now leading a coalition to introduce this system as a way to improve food security in developing nations. The housing first model, which is one of the innovations we have in Finland, has also been discussed here in Ireland. So I say a few words about that. Finland seems to be the only EU country with declining homelessness. The aim is to eradicate homelessness by 2027. The housing first policy is built on the belief that housing is a basic human and social right. This is a big change from previous thinking in Finland. As late as in the 1980s, a homeless person would only be provided housing if they proved to be socially viable and sober. The housing first policy doesn't think housing as a prize for receiving when your life is on track. Instead, it's part of the foundation to build your life on. Short-term housing, such as shelters, are only a starting point. People need long-term solutions, according to this policy, and beginning with supported housing and aiming for independent living. By increasing social housing and involving experts more closely on all stages of planning, more people have gotten a place to live. An important aspect of ending homelessness in Finland is the general housing benefits, which for some is the main reason they are able to afford their homes. There are, of course, still challenges, and we need more affordable housing, rehabilitation centers, and a deeper integration of social and health services. We also had the so-called basic income pilot from 2017-2018, when an income of 560 per month was paid to 2,000 unemployed people seeking jobs. That is also an innovation that has been discussed many times also here in Ireland. I can say a few words if there are any questions related to that later on. Dear friends, to sum up and looking ahead, the most important feature, we believe, of the Finnish welfare state is considered its universalism. High quality childcare and school services have provided equal possibilities for all children. Universal access to healthcare is essential for the population's health and well-being. Childcare enables both genders to participate equally in paid labor and parenthood. Actually, the latest statistics show that men and women that are working now are equally taking part in the household work. So that's quite an achievement. It's the first time. Public services have been important for gender equality in Finland in general. The Finnish welfare system is not the same as it was during its golden years in 1980s, but the Nordic welfare model is still distinct and fares well in comparison with other welfare states models on most dimensions of welfare. The main challenge is to ensure sustained financing of the services. The proportion of older people and the resulting demand for social and health services is increasing, while the number of people in labor market is decreasing. To mitigate the situation, a major welfare well-being services reform after 14 years of political discussion has now been agreed and is starting next January. The aim of the health and social services reform is to consolidate and ensure also in the future equal access to healthcare, social welfare, and rescue services can be provided. The responsibility of services will be transferred from around 300 municipalities to 21 new welfare districts. And these welfare districts work separately from the municipalities and central government. As mentioned, one of the key assets of the Finnish society is the high level of trust in institutions and fellow citizens. This has been crucial in developing the social security system. At the core of universalism, namely, is the sense of communality, which is built on trust. It provides for the legitimacy of the public institutions and redistribution of income. In order to ensure that we can sustain the welfare state, taxpayers need to have confidence in the system. Fortunately, our system itself builds trust because everybody enjoys some benefits of the system at some stage of their life. If the welfare services, however, are perceived as unfair, too generous, or seen as financed by growing tax burden or bigger public debt, the trust in the system may weaken. The media and factual public information play a key role in supporting an open and factual discussion. Solidarity requires that people continue to trust each other and the authorities. Latest polls in Finland show that 93% of people think that paying taxes is a civic responsibility, and that 9 out of 10 people are happy to support the welfare state. And 88% of these people in survey pays happily to tax to support the welfare state. The welfare system needs to move on with times. Lifestyles and working practices are experiencing huge transformations. People's expectations are changing. The society needs to be able to respond to increasingly diverse demands and situations. Dear friends, the high rankings of Finland in many country surveys, including being the world's happiest nation the past 5 years, for the do not mean that our problems have been solved. We have challenges, but the strong social safety nets has demonstrated its strengths also in a very globalized and interdependent world. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. A fascinating insight. I think it would be fair to say we often hear so much about the Nordic countries, but the detail that you presented with us there, I think, give a huge amount of food for thought, and the widest audience possible, I would suggest, should hear it. Thank you very much for that paper. And if you stay with us, we'll have some questions after the next paper at the end of this session. Okay, our next paper comes from the National Economic and Social Council from Larry O'Connell and Anne-Marie McGauran. Larry is the director of NESC, has been their senior economist since 2007. He's worked on a range of policy areas, including Ireland's transition to low carbon and digital future, housing and land, climate change and sustainable development, higher education funding, and Ireland's five-part crisis. He previously worked in the National Centre for Partnership and Performance, Chagas, UCD, Waterford Institute of Technology. He has a degree in agricultural economics and completed his PhD at UCD on the internationalisation of Irish business. Anne-Marie McGauran is policy analyst with NESC. Her work focuses on equality and social issues. In NESC, she has led the 2021 projects on digital inclusion and the rollout of the Community Call initiative to support vulnerable people during COVID-19 lockdowns. In 2022, she led the project looking at how well-being policies are implemented internationally. She's currently working on NESC project on Ireland's economic resilience and vulnerability, looking at social vulnerability. Anne-Marie was also co-author of NESC's important study on jobless households and its study on the future of Ireland's welfare state. So the paper is coming from both our guests, and I think Larry is leading off.
Thank you very much, Mick, for that very nice introduction. You said Sean nearly embarrassed you. Well, you were beginning to embarrass us with such a glowing tribute, but thank you. We're both, myself and Anne-Marie, are delighted to be here today. We wrote the paper for this conference with our colleague Helen Johnson, who's also on the call, I think. We're really privileged to be here. I think it's a seminal event, a very important event in the Irish calendar every year to have this conference, one which we always participate in. So it was really great to be asked today to give one of the keynote speaker papers for it. So thank you very much to Father Sean and the organisers for the invite. Our theme is that Ireland, Ireland's journey has taken place around well-being for Ireland, and it's in a sense it's quite an interesting journey. It's a journey that we all kind of agree, I think, has to happen because we feel we need a change. The final destination is probably being decided, or at least not worked on, so that makes the journey interesting. We don't quite know where we're going to end up. And maybe to the annoyance of all of the children in the back, we still don't quite know if we're nearly there yet or not. So we're going to try and talk you through what we feel is a very important journey that's taking place. I think our core message is that this really is an important journey, and what it's trying to do is to think more comprehensively, more sustainably, and more robustly about what progress actually means in our economy and our society. We argue in the paper that the journey, we point out that the journey probably started maybe almost, in 2009. Nest did some early work in this. I know at that stage, Social Justice Ireland, you can go back actually. Sorry. So at that stage, Social Justice Ireland also did some work on it. And we feel that journey, obviously it probably stalled somewhat with the financial crisis, but certainly with the programme for government, it restarted in earnest. What we try to argue in the paper is, today, it feels somewhat like that we've developed a fairly high level, if you like, kind of searchlight that helps to guide us on this journey. But really, I think as the terrain gets a little bit rougher, and I think it always does when you start to get into the detail, then I think we feel that we need to move towards what we would argue is the capacity to have a spotlight to look at particular issues in more detail. And we'll talk you through that sort of process in the paper. So our 5 parts that we're going to walk through is why would you develop a wellbeing framework? What steps have been taken in Ireland? Thirdly, how would we then begin to think about, how is it being embedded right into policy? And then how the how-to question of focusing in on vulnerabilities and inequality. And finally, some brief thoughts about where to go next. So very briefly, just to start, I mean, why would you develop a well-being framework? And I suppose that the core argument really is that there are limits to the current ways that we measure progress. And I think it's important, the limits are both economic, social, and environmental. So when we think about the economics, as Father Sean said at the start, the particular measures that we use, whether GDP or GNI star modified versions of which focus on value added within an economy, really they disconnect somewhat from the citizens a sense of their ability to actually their own economic well-being. And even when we look at things like actual individual consumption, it's just difficult to see do those measures really replicate how people, if you like, the sense of money in your pocket and how far it goes. Secondly, there's definitely limits from a societal perspective. At a general level, I do think that the issues, measurement of progress based on GDP, etc., really does not resonate with people's lived experience on a day-to-day basis. And thirdly, in terms of the environmental dimension, the measures don't really capture the value of our environmental assets, nor do they capture fully the destruction that happens linked to the current GDP model. And particularly, I suppose, when we think about things like, a statistic like that 90% of our protected habitats are actually in trouble in Ireland, well, where does that show up in the current kind of accounting of progress in an Irish context? So what we feel is that the GDP doesn't really provide a sufficiently detailed picture of the living conditions that people experience. And it is not to say that issues like GDP, and they clearly have a role and they have an impact in certain spheres. What we really try to do here is to broaden beyond GDP to look at a more detailed set of measures. So in terms of when we I suppose think really about this measure based on GDP, I suppose our sense is that it really it gives you a very flattened or one-dimensional sense of progress. But maybe the other issue, and I think it was very interesting to listen to the ambassador's comments, it can be that it creates a disconnect between the lived experience and, if you like, the policy experience, and that can get reflected in a sense, I suppose, in people not trusting that their experience they have doesn't resonate with what they think the policy system is trying to do for them. And therefore, trust is a critical metric. And it is very interesting in an Irish context, as I listen to the ambassador, I think trust is also high here. But where we are seeing issues around trust now is with younger generations having issues with their trust in government and trust within the system. And I think, therefore, that's another argument why we need this richer picture in terms of what progress is and how it connects with people's lived experience. So when we look then at the different steps in terms of what are involved in developing a wellbeing approach, I suppose, I mean, the definition of a wellbeing approach, it's a multidimensional approach. It uses objective and subjective measures of current and future living conditions. The key message, though, as we looked at in detail, as I said at the start, it is still continuing to evolve. And I think the key message is that there is a need for a lot of learning by doing. And there is a need for that learning by doing in terms of working out what are the correct measures and refining them. That learning by doing really depends on very active participation and consultation with people who are actually impacted by policy. I mean, that is the essence of the wellbeing approach, is that everybody is impacted by policy. So the ambition here is to give everybody a say in the shape of that policy. That's a seismic shift, but it is beginning, and I think that's what we need to see more of. So
I'm terribly sorry, Larry. I'm so sorry. Your slides aren't moving. Are they meant to be moving?
No, that's where we're there yet.
You're still going.
Right
okay,
side.
Thank you. My apologies.
That's right, yes, thank you. So just in terms of the different steps in it, I mean, there are this statement, when we looked at internationally at various approaches to well-being, this slide sort of captures the main pieces. Maybe I won't dwell on them too long, But there's a vision, as I said, public involvement. Often the work begins with a dashboard of indicators. It moves on towards trying to do things like performance reporting. We also saw that as well-being develops, and Anne-Marie will talk about this a bit more, you see it becoming more formalized in terms of legislation and institutional structures, applying it to budgeting, figuring out ways that it impacts on budgets and how they're set, and new ways of working in terms of getting people to work across government in a less siloed approach. So for the next slide then, what we really then try to look at, well, what steps have actually been taken in Ireland. As I said, I think there were some early steps in 2009 and work that was done, and probably a lot of work then between that and the next phase of action in the Irish context. A lot of work done within the OECD and in Ireland in the PPN networks in trying to think about well-being. But as I said, the real impetus came with the programme for government, where there was a sense of, obviously there was a commitment to develop a well-being approach in Ireland. So this little graphic just gives you a quick sense of where that work has gone. NESC was involved in 2020 to try and build on this idea that it should be participative by going out and talking to experts and stakeholders and talking to citizens through surveys to try to really see how should we approach the wellbeing framework. There was strong support for the OECD as being a good starting point. And I know Carrie is on the call later, and Carrie was very helpful to us here, and we had a very good workshop with Carrie and her colleagues. So on foot of that work, the government then published its report on developing a wellbeing framework. That led to work within the CSO on developing a dashboard of indicators, which, that really got us out of the starting blocks because it allowed us to see what this would look like in practice. A lot of additional work has happened since within the Department of Taoiseach in terms of consultation to identify with stakeholders and with citizens to really sort of develop this approach and to get further buy-in to it. And alongside that, a lot of additional research, including research that we've carried out here in NESC that Anne-Marie will talk about, but also really interesting work within the Department of Finance and within the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And really what they're trying to look at is to just identify how you begin to move this forward. And as I said at the start, I think that's what we really need to do. And that's the journey that we're on. So I'm going to hand over to Anne-Marie now, who's just going to take you through some of that research.
Okay, thanks very much, Larry. And great to see so many of you logged on this morning to find out more about wellbeing and wellbeing approaches in Ireland. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the report that I and my colleague Elaine Kennedy worked on in NESC, looking at how wellbeing approaches had been embedded in policy in New Zealand, Wales and Scotland, because they're a bit further ahead of us. So there's different approaches used in the three countries. In New Zealand, there's a very strong focus on incorporating wellbeing into the national budget process. And the New Zealand Treasury has developed two wellbeing frameworks, the Living Standards Framework and a Maori version of that framework, which unfortunately I can't pronounce, but maybe Gabriel McLeod later today will talk about that. So the Living Standards Framework there looks at individual and collective well-being. So for example, health, knowledge, family and friends. It looks also at institutions and governance. It looks under that at society, firms and the government, and it looks at the general wealth of New Zealand, like its natural environment, its social cohesion, its financial situation and human capability. So basically by looking at all of these things in the framework, they are able to draw information on these into decisions that are made on the budget. And they have also brought in legislation to help embed wellbeing objectives into the national budgeting process. And they've gone further than that to look at one group in particular, poverty of children. And again, they have a requirement on each budget date that the government would report on child poverty measures in the budget. Now, Wales has gone for a different approach. In 2015, it passed its Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to build on the Sustainable Development Goals and put sustainable development at the centre of decision making. So all public body in Wales are required to put this sustainable development at the centre of their decisions. they've developed a future generations framework for projects. And that's a kind of a set of questions that policymakers in public bodies ask themselves to think about how they can ensure that their services take sustainable development and future generations into account. And they have a number of kind of monitoring and reporting mechanisms. The Welsh Government publishes annual reports on progress towards meeting these objectives. And there is also a Future Generations Commissioner who monitors progress and provides support. And Scotland has developed a national performance framework, and this sets out an overall vision for Scotland, and it's got 11 broad national outcomes that policy works towards. Increased wellbeing is one of these. They also brought in legislation in 2015 to require public bodies to take wellbeing approaches into account. Not all public bodies, but a large number of them. And their Auditor General is involved in monitoring the extent to which a wellbeing approach is embedded. So quite different approaches in the three countries. So interesting for Ireland to learn from that. But really what we found in NESC is if you look at the approaches taken in these three countries and also in relation to some specific policy frameworks in Ireland, that there are 4 stages when you're embedding a wellbeing approach into how you make policy. So the first stage is to build shared consensus and understanding. And obviously there is something that starts off that process. We found that it's very important to have strong leadership to start off the process of looking at a wellbeing approach. And in fact, in a number of countries, there was a politician, high-level politician, and a high-level public servant who were both interested in pushing forward this agenda. So that's important for leadership. And that comes from a desire to do things differently. For example, after the crash in New Zealand, less focus on GDP, for example. And in Wales, international commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals helped kind of push forward their approach. And at that stage, there's a lot of consultation and building awareness about what well-being is. And then you move on to design a workable framework. Once you've decided to adopt a well-being approach, what kind of framework do you need to embed that in policymaking? So in that stage, people agree national outcomes. They agree indicators to help us measure where we are now and where we're going. There's a process of developing more evidence to help make decisions about wider well-being. So for example, more environmental evidence and more evidence on people's lived experience. And in this stage, there's also provision of guidance for policymakers on how they can embed this approach in their work. Then the next stage really, once you have the framework, is implanting that into policymaking. So as we've seen, there's different ways of doing this. Some countries use legislation, some use budget processes to do that. Usually at this stage, supportive structures are set up to help this kind of embedding to happen. And there's also monitoring and review. So that's done by different organizations, sometimes by Parliament, sometimes by external bodies, sometimes by internal bodies. So then after you've had that stage of implanting, monitoring and reviewing, there's kind of a stage where the approach is deepened and integrated into more policy areas and more work. So in this stage, there would be application of well-being to subgroups like children in poverty, for example. There would be more work to integrate the outcomes that national and local organizations work towards, and kind of more of a move towards saying, well, a well-being framework isn't just another framework, but a kind of an overarching framework. So it can replace other strategies and integrate them into them rather than being just another strategy, another framework that has to have attention paid to it. We found that each of these stages, the learning from these helps strengthen the other stages. And it takes time to embed a well-being approach. It's challenging to develop good data as well. That was another finding that we found from looking at the different countries. And at all times, leadership, dialogue, resources, and review are really important to help further the wellbeing framework through different stages. So just to think about, what kind of impacts have these frameworks had? And I'm going to take an Irish example to show the kind of impacts that can be taken from a kind of wellbeing approach or wellbeing framework approach.
Can I just ensure? And Colette, people are saying to me that those slides are not moving on the screen. Is that the case for you?
That's exactly it. We can just see your first slide.
Yeah, it's still at the first slide, unfortunately.
I don't know if we can, like they're moving here on the screen that we're sharing, so we're not sure. Is it? I don't know.
Maybe we'll stop share and just.
Do you want to try sharing them, Colette, or?
Let's try again.
I
Yeah.
can pull them up on my screen and see if I can share them. Bear with me. Oh, hang on. Will we
If I move this, does anything move?
You're moving, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So very sorry that we missed out on the slides, but they'll be available on our Nest Twitter account. If you have a look, there will be a link there for them. Our colleague did a lot of work on them as well. They look good, so good that we'll be able to see them now. So just to think about the impact in Ireland, Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures, or BOBF, the National Policy Framework for Children and Young People, does take a very strong wellbeing approach. It has, national outcomes to work towards for children and young people. It has a dashboard of indicators to measure progress. It has set up a number of structures for more collaboration. It has a number of review mechanisms. So what kind of impact has that had? So the reviews of BOBF have shown that one thing that's happened is through setting up formal high-level structures for collaborative work, there's been much greater shared understanding and agreement on key issues. For example, on what you would prioritise to combat child poverty, for example. And those structures for collaborative work have been very important as well, because they are a way for NGOs on the ground to regularly link in with high-level decision makers in government departments and agencies. And there's also consultative structures set up with young people that are ongoing. And for example, a number of years ago, they said that they would like to see free public transport for younger people. And then in the budget, we since have had half-price public transport for younger people. So you can see this direct link between the consultation with people on the ground into decision making. There's also been joint policy documents agreed, for example, on child obesity and how to tackle that through these processes. And there have been changes to specific welfare payments for children arising out of some of these discussions. So we can definitely see that these approaches do have an impact on the ground, and hopefully we'll see more in future. So the work that Nest did looking at how wellbeing approaches had been embedded in other countries were used in the second Irish government report, and it has a number of recommendations on how they're going to embed a wellbeing framework into policy making over time. So first of all, they're going to have annual published high-level analysis of the wellbeing dashboard that's been adopted, and there's also going to be incorporation of that into the national budget process. It's going to be referred to in budget documentation, and it's going to be discussed at the National Economic Dialogue as well. There's also going to be more embedding of this approach into expenditure and evaluation policy. There's going to be further research and policy developments by other departments, for example, by DEEPR. There's going to be empowering of government departments to develop their own wellbeing approaches as well. And there's going to be clear supporting structures to support this. For example, the Cabinet Committee on Recovery and Investment will be an overarching clearinghouse for this approach. So the wellbeing approach, it's noted in this report, does link into another of other cross-governmental approaches to budgeting that connect to wellbeing frameworks. So these include performance-based budgeting, which focuses very much on outcomes. And that's a key issue in a wellbeing approach, that you're looking at outcomes for people from policy, not just the money that is inputted into a policy, but what are the outcomes. And also the wellbeing approach will link to equality budgeting and green budgeting processes, which are being carried out here to try and have a stronger focus on equality and on an environmental issue. So another piece of work then that Nest hopes to do, linking to the wellbeing framework, would be a stronger focus on inequality in Ireland. So when we did the consultation in 2020 and 21, very strong thing that came out was that there was a desire to focus more on inequality in Ireland through a wellbeing framework. And that's generated by a number of factors, like our high degree of market income inequality in Ireland, our rate of wealth inequality, which is twice as high as income inequality. The poverty rate of several groups. In 20 years ago, the unemployed, lone parents, and those with a disability were most likely to be affected by consistent poverty, and that's still the same today. And the strong thing that came up in that consultation was the unequal access to affordable, reliable services. So in our work, we looked at how other countries had addressed inequalities, for example, child poverty, using wellbeing frameworks. So in Scotland, part of their national performance framework, one of the outcomes is to reduce poverty. So they have looked at child poverty in particular and passed legislation on this. So, for example, it requires actions on specific groups affected by child poverty, like children in lone parent families. It also requires action not just on income, but also on education, housing, childcare, and health. So that would be very typical of the broad approach taken by wellbeing approaches. And also it requires that individuals affected by poverty, as well as their representative groups, must be consulted on delivery plans for meeting child poverty targets. So that again is very typical of wellbeing approach, you know, that you go out and consult and dialogue with groups affected. In New Zealand, the approach they've taken is that the budget must outline how it will reduce child poverty. And they have a number of new actions to reduce child poverty, like a tax credit for the first year of a child's life, more paid parental leave, increased accommodation supplement, winter energy payments, and an innovative program whereby schools in low-income areas don't ask parents for voluntary donations, but instead those schools will get $150 per student per year. And really the approach there was saying, if we look at poverty in a kind of broader way, we see that there's a range of reasons why families with children have lower income. So this tries to, you know, reduce their spending on housing, reduce their spending on energy, reduce their spending on education, and so have more disposable income in the household to help combat child poverty. So where to next? NESC wants to see optimizing of our consultation processes to help build up more dialogue and consultation in the wellbeing approach. So the BOBF consultation structures are a very good example there of what we can do. We want to see more data and evidence developed, and there are commitments from the CSO to do that. We want to see more work at integrating wellbeing frameworks into the policy system, for example, deepening its application in the budget process, and then maybe thinking about how is that monitored in future? Is there a role maybe for our Auditor General, for our Parliament there? It'd be great to see improved governance of the wellbeing framework with maybe more involvement of those bodies. And there's also an opportunity to link wellbeing frameworks in North and South of Ireland through a shared island approach. So just some interesting issues to bear in mind that came up in our research and probably will be referred to today. So for example, what's the best balance between focusing on outcomes and generating a vision for wellbeing? And also, how much should wellbeing approaches try and impact across all policy areas, or should they have a stronger focus on one or two key issues like child poverty? So for more in NESC's wellbeing work, we have a link here as well, or just go to our NESC wellbeing or publications page. Thanks very much for listening. We look forward to your questions, and apologies again for the difficulties with the slides.
Thanks very much, Anne-Marie, for that, and to Larry, and very interesting perspective again. No, thankfully, we're very much on time, and we can have some questions, and we have some very interesting questions. First of all, I might start with Riley in terms of a couple that are directed for yourself, and they would be as follows. Finland has practically eradicated homelessness. Ireland has signed up to the Lisbon Declaration on ending homelessness by 2030, yet we're being further away from that goal than ever. Ambassador, do you think that the well-being focus of Finnish welfare means people come before profits that can be made from housing? And just before you address that, on a similar theme, we also have one on yes, and I think this is actually very relevant one. Politically, how was the attitude in Finland shifted towards regarding housing from a prize to the foundation of a good life, as of course you laid out in your paper about the redirection of policy in that respect?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much once again, having heard Larry and Anne-Marie and the real expert opinions. I feel very humbled to be part of this discussion. Trying to, as an ambassador, we are learning by doing, and this has been actually an education also for me. What a great narrative we have in Finland. I must say I'm very proud of our the generations that actually built this welfare society. On the housing first issue, I think I should, these are two very good questions. Thank you for those. The housing first, I think it has three different bases. So one of course, is that there's a ethical aspect, which is that human dignity belongs to everyone. That's very strong in the Finnish ethics. The second one is that in our constitution, we have a provision for the state to promote everyone's right to housing and support people that don't have the housing. And the third point is just very follow the money is one of my mottos. It makes economic sense because it's more expensive actually to do kind of a short-term shelter base. They have found out that that through this policy is actually they are saving money because it's like maybe 10,000 per person if you have to kind of keep on taking care of the homeless people. So on the long run, it pays off. To provide for this system, you need affordable housing. So you need to have housing where people can rent, because in Finland, people that live there, many of them are paying rent, and that for that take this housing allowance in order to pay for that. So you need to have a kind of a whole of society, the municipalities and the state, and then NGOs are all together working on this, making affordable housing available, and then taking care of that the people that don't have houses can live into them. The policy, all parties have been supporting this policy since the 80s. The question was that they realized in early 2000 that long-term homelessness was not declining. So that's why they took this new approach that there was a four men, women, kind of a wise men, wise women party that made this paper, and that has made all the difference in reducing the homelessness. But one thing is you need to have affordable housing to be part of this. I guess that's, if that is sufficient for the housing first. I saw that there were other issues if you want to raise them, Mick.
Yeah. Well, in particular, the issue of universalism. Michelle Murphy asked here, like, do you think that the decision to incorporate the concept of universalism, the baby box, which I think is a fantastic idea, maternity benefit and services development of social housing and housing for all, has had a positive impact on social inclusion, social development in Finland, and made people more appreciative and supportive of the social contract? And I suppose in a very similar theme, John McGeady asks whether there is any debate in Finland about the appropriateness of high earners having access to universal services.
Yeah, I guess like in all democracies, there is and there should be debate, because that's the only way to bring very kind of efficient and forward-looking policies. And in the multi-party coalitions where we live, we always have had multi-party coalitions in the government that has brought in sometimes the so-called left, sometimes the so-called right into. But basically, the welfare society has always been supported once it was created, starting from the 60s. And you should, I remind again that this is very much related to our history, that we were a very divided country after the Civil War. But the politicians then from left and right saw that social inclusion and welfare state were key to kind of ensure political stability also. Of course, there are debates about, that the rich people, that the people that earn a lot of money. In Finland, we also have a system that every year all tax payments are released, that you can see who has paid so much tax, meaning that some millionaires are contributing a lot to our welfare state. If you don't want your name or your tax income being published, your name can still be published. So transparent is one key of this. So people see how much other people are paying taxes and so on and so forth. There have been discussion, for example, in Helsinki, the highest daycare fee is less than 300. And that has been debated, but the basic support for the welfare state comes out what I was mentioning, those high rates of people being able and willing and happy to pay taxes for the welfare system, is that everybody benefits from that system at certain point of time. And when the economy has become globalized, people have realized, like we did in 90s, that everybody can be all of a sudden a businessman, a worker, a professional, professor. It can be all of a sudden in a situation where the safety net is needed for the time being. So there's an understanding that the economy is very volatile, and social safety nets can bring you back to the kind of the labor force, so to say. So I think there are discussions, but you can see from the support for the high taxes that we pay that there is less criticism that's real. I should also say that that in terms of whether this is the only way forward, you know, that universal services are provided. I'm not an expert, and I'm sure there are discussions whether we should go just looking at those targeted that really needed for that day. There are, of course, efficiencies. And then, as I said, you never know. And from the economic point of view, it's very important for kind of market economies that you have labor force that is available and healthy to come to work.
Yes, very interesting indeed. One quick thing, Ariel, before I turn to Larry and Anne-Marie, would it be fair to say, in terms, therefore, of the political context in Finland, there is no major political party or movement that is pushing for example, lower taxes and smaller services, as we have in a lot of the big and small, including our own Western countries?
We have so-called libertarian voices also that think that there should be a higher, lower tax also, including for corporate tax. Ours is much over 20 compared to Ireland. That's of course very high. And from our TDP, tax is over 40%, and I think in Ireland it's around 20. So that is kind of the basic bread and butter that we are used to. But in terms of the parties, the bigger parties, they all support the welfare state because they see the benefit. They have seen it in the past. They are seeing it now. But as I mentioned, there is a well-being reform going on, and it took 3 consecutive governments from all different parties to agree on this reform, and it was very difficult. But finally, they made it through, and it's a little bit like your Schlointer. That was, you know, everybody agrees to that, but to implement that, we are only starting now in January. But these are political issues that need kind of a multi-party approaches in order to make sure that the political parties that you vote for are supporting the system, and that you keep the people with you. And that's why the transparency also in terms of the tax paying, and that people trust that the authorities are using their money efficiently. And that's why this well-being reform that is now put forward is very important part of this going forward. And we still, there remains to be seen what challenges we actually have in terms of the implementation of that huge reform. Imagine 300 municipalities are now giving up their responsibilities to 21 districts to take over the well-being services in all parts of Finland. Huge entertainment.
Very interesting, and particularly I have to say the transparency element, which would be contrary to the type of certain secrecy culture that perhaps goes back to colonial history or not, but that's for another day. Turning to Larry and Anne-Marie, one question here. Do you both think that the well-being framework finally brings a balance between the economic and the social, or will it take more convincing?
Thanks, Mick. I might just say something to that, and I know Anne-Marie might come back in maybe on some of the things that the ambassador has been saying as well about the welfare side. I suppose what I see it, Mick, and NESC has long held this view that the economic, the social, and the environmental need to be, mutually supportive. So that's the ambition here. Then the wellbeing framework when we went to look at it, we asked experts across the country and we asked citizens, and broadly, people really saw this as an opportunity to try and bring about a kind of a transformation, to make that a reality. So to bring the economic, social, and environmental mutually exclusive. But you're absolutely right. There's a trade-off, and choices always have to be made. Where I see the change that, or the promise of the wellbeing framework is, maybe it brings more data and more evidence and maybe more transparency to how those choices and trade-offs can get made between the different dimensions of policy. And so I don't think it's a silver bullet in that it suddenly changes it, that now, you know, the economic and social are fully aligned, but it begins to get us down that road, because we commit ourselves to more data and more evidence to bring the trade-offs to light, and then work out how we'll actually kind of resolve them. So that's where I see the promise. I think rather than see it, you know, I know somebody else asked, but do we see welfare as negative? Well, I think we're trying to move towards where we don't see it in that way, and then we're trying to identify, well, where are the pinch points? Where do we make decisions that actually put the economy and the welfare in tension, and try to resolve those? So it's a promise, Mick, at the moment, but it's something we've got to kind of work forward on it. So, but I might just hand over to Anne-Marie. That's all right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really just wanted to say to Riley that, you know, not to feel that she's not an expert. You know, what Finland is doing is fantastic. It's like well-being approach in action. And actually, we were looking, when we were deciding the countries to look at for the NESC report, we did look at Finland for a while because it's done some really interesting things, but we weren't able to get that much material in English because, you know, don't read Finnish, obviously, very you know, not many people do, but it seems to have very interesting approaches, because when we were working on how the COVID pandemic was managed in different countries, we were fascinated by the fact that Finland was one of the few countries in Europe that had lots of PPE, because it has a very interesting approach to ensuring it has security of supply in the event of a crisis. It's interesting to hear that they also have more affordable housing maybe than the rest of Europe. So there's obviously a lot of interesting structures and processes there to look in the long term and medium term at well-being for society and economy.
And I suppose on a similar theme, but being a bit more specific to both of you, what would the top priorities be for a government in this country if it were to really prioritise well-being in the annual budgetary process?
Yeah, well,
big list.
It's a big list, but I mean, and I suppose really maybe what we're trying to figure out is, I mean, obviously the priorities are at the moment, you know, things like housing, climate change, poverty, child, like, so we know in a sense that list. I think the challenge for the well-being work is, so what kind of fresh perspective will it bring to kind of, when we drill down into the data, is there a new way to approach some of the, or, you know, as we were talking about, if you put the spotlight in inequality, you know, using the well-being framework, will it bring something, a fresh perspective on what we believe to be the top priority? So I'm not answering your question, Mick, but I think when the promise of well-being framework, we'll know when it really is throwing up something that we didn't already know to be the top priorities. And I'm not sure it's done that yet in Ireland.
I know in a number of other countries, child poverty has quickly become a big priority, as you know, maybe because everybody agrees that they really wanted to address it. So that would be a useful thing here. And I think the environmental focus, you know, is very important to have more of an environmental focus, and it could help facilitate that.
And I wonder, is there an issue over, and we've seen this similarly with the whole issue of addressing climate change. Is the will there to address properly a well-being framework in terms of what's perceived to be the cost? And unfortunately, in a lot of these things, the cost often equates to the short-term cost, unfortunately, but that seems to be a perspective, it suggests, right across the kind of power centres we have in this country.
What I mean, maybe there's two slightly different issues. I mean, in the sense that, like, the climate change, I think absolutely we know from all the evidence that there's a massive problem, and then the issue of whether we get people to act on it, that's you're right, that's something that needs to be addressed. But the wellbeing framework maybe is trying to come at all of that from a slightly different perspective, is to say is, can we zone in on precisely what is, you know, can we get at it with using wellbeing framework to say, well, on an issue like Well, we know housing is a problem, but would the wellbeing framework bring anything fresh to light about when we look across all domains of government? Will it, so in other words, will it help us to pinpoint in on some precise aspect of the problem, and therefore maybe, you know, it helps us to target resources better? I mean, that's what I see. If it begins to work, that's what it will do. It will target resources to where they're most needed and most effectively. And I think what Anne-Marie is saying, we see in other countries where they're slightly ahead of us, where there's kind of inklings that it begins to do that. But I think it's really early days to know exactly where wellbeing has made that type of impact.
And Anne-Marie, just another question, I think it's directed to you from John McGeady. You mentioned the need for leadership as the first step of embedding a wellbeing framework. Have you anything else to say in terms of what's needed from that type of leadership?
I think we did find in New Zealand and in Scotland definitely that there was a senior civil servant and a senior politician who were both interested in working on this. So I think that's really important because it provides you with, you know, the leadership from the political side for it to happen, and then also the leadership like internally within policymaking for that to happen. And here, like our wellbeing framework now is from a government commitment. It's in the programme for government, and I think it's something that was kind of driven maybe by the Green Party, that there would be a commitment to have other ways of measuring progress apart from the kind of more classic GDP, and also that then there would be work to embed these new processes within policy making. So that's an important start. And I think, you know, there is work ongoing on this in the Department of Finance, in a central high level unit in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and in the Department of Taoiseach. So that's very good because there's that kind of, you know, strong focus on it in central departments who can have influence on other departments' work.
Yeah, very good point. And I suppose, as you're saying, we've seen that in relation to other things. It's one thing that it's embedded in the programme for government, but unless you give it to somebody to be their particular focus, both in terms of the elected government and the permanent government, that's where the leadership can make a real difference in terms of addressing the whole issue. I think that's very much so. One final thing from Joe Little: both papers have emphasised the centrality of trust in public institutions to sustaining a wellbeing approach. Our wellbeing dashboard, which was developed by the CSO, shows housing flashing green. To my mind, that risks discrediting the Irish process significantly. Very good observation from Joe. Unfortunately, though, as is always the case, the clock has run against us. And I think from that point of view, we'll have to put a cap on it at this stage. I have to say, two very interesting papers to get the ball rolling this morning from Ambassador from Finland, Riley Lanalampi, and from NESC's Larry O'Connell and Anne-Marie McGorn. Thank you all very much for that this morning, and hopefully you'll stay with us, and we'll keep it motoring from here on in. We're going to take a 10-minute coffee break now, and folks will be back with you very promptly at 11:30. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.